Hello, and welcome to Regrets I've Had a Few. I'm Paul Hunter, Artistic Director of Told by an Idiot, and this is a podcast where I talk to friends and colleagues delving into what made them the person they are today.
Hello, and welcome. My guest this month is a director, a writer, a translator, and a theatre maker. And he's worked all over the place in lots of different countries, lots of different theatres, and lots of different languages. He was an associate director at the Bush Theatre in London and was part of the hugely successful show Misty. And recently, very recently, he directed an utterly sublime version, his own version of a translation of Unesco's The Chairs. I think, and I might ask him this, but I think what links a lot of this is a passionate love of the act of theatre itself, is what I think about, but I'll grill him on that. Welcome, Omar Elerian.
Hello, Paul.
Very nice to meet you. Thank you so much for joining us from Milan.
Yes, it's my pleasure. I'm back in Milan now.
Excellent, having just been here in London. Now, I know we've been talking recently because we at The Idiots are planning what is in some ways a football show based around my team and their greatest ever achievement, Aston Villa, 40 years since they won the European Cup. And I wanted you to join me, unaware that you were also a passionate not Villa fan, obviously, a passionate football fan, following Inter. That's correct, is it not?
That's it, yeah. I'm an Inter Milan fan, which I suspect has some similarities to being a Villa fan. There's lots of suffering involved.
I think that's a very universal theme, isn't it, in football, unless you follow very particular teams. Now, exactly. I won't dwell on suffering too much, but of course, as we speak, it's the morning after, sadly, your elimination against Liverpool in the Champions League. And I listened on the radio. I just wondered briefly, without swearing too much, what your thoughts are this morning as you reflect on that game.
Well, it was kind of expected, to be honest. I mean, Liverpool are a bit out of our league at the moment, although Inter, of course, has a wonderful history of European football. But I would say at the moment we're not even close at the level of Premier League football and Liverpool specifically. And we lost 2-0 on the first leg, although we played very well. And yesterday we were about to edge it. We had just scored, and 1 minute later they sent off one of our players. So I think I wonder
if it's that great footballing cliche, whether you're in a period of transition.
We are. We lost 3 very good players last year because of money and budget. I mean, the Italian league, maybe 20, 30 years ago, was still kind of the top of the cream, but now it feels like the money's drained out because of many reasons: poor management, lack of vision, and whatnot. So we tend to lose our best players and then rebuild every year. But we're doing very well in the league.
That's good.
Kind of
and actually, when you said you lost the first leg 2-0, when we were talking a while ago, you reminded me of your extraordinary comeback against Aston Villa in the UEFA Cup when we beat you 2-0, and then at the San Siro you scored 3.
Yeah, that's one of my earliest football memories. I think it was like 1994 or 93, something like
you're
that.
Absolutely early,
or
90s.
Maybe even earlier.
I think, yeah.
And I mean, that was we had a wonderful team at the time, and I remember listening to that match on the radio. And when you do have one of these historic comebacks, from 2-0, you go like, you score the first goal and you go like, oh, is it going to happen? And then you go 2-0 and you go like, oh wow, it's actually possible.
Let's not dwell on that too much, Omar. Let's move. As the host of this podcast, I'm going to move things swiftly along
to theatre. There is a lot of, I think it was Roland Barthes who once said, like, if if there was the same level of engagement in front of a theater show than there was in front of a football match, things would be a lot more exciting.
Well, I think it's true. And part of the desire to do this show, Would You Bet Against Us, which is a kind of mix of autobiography and, as I said, the football, is in a way to explore that notion of how people engage with a live event. And I know you're obviously very interested in the nature of what makes something live and the spontaneity so I'm very interested in that. But if I could take you further back now to childhood, did you grow up in Milan?
I grew up in many places, actually. My father is Palestinian, or of Palestinian descent, because he was born in Egypt in 1950, because my family, his parents, had to leave Palestine in 1948 when part of it became the state of Israel. And my mother is Italian, so I was born in Milan. But then we traveled quite a lot when I was a child. We lived in the Middle East, in Kuwait. We settled back in Italy for a little while. We then went to Egypt and to the United States. And then my mom was fed up with moving around and changing countries. So we then settled back in Milan when I was like 11.
Okay.
And that's where I grew up, my formative years, as they say, all the way into graduating from university. And then I started my own nomadic
journey
life later, moving to Paris first and London, and now I've come full circle. I have kids of my own. So.
and you're back in Milan. If I could take you back to that kind of 11, 12-year-old period. Can you remember, was there much engagement with theatre in the family? Did you go to the theatre?
No, not at all. Not at all. We were living in the suburbs of Milan, where my parents still live. Actually, I live in the city now, but we grew up around 40 minutes by train from Milan. And no, my family was never particularly interested in the arts or theater specifically. My mom is a secretary. My dad is, now he's retired, business manager. So yeah, theater, the encounter with theater happened a bit later, when I was 17, 18 in high school. Completely by chance, as many of the things that happened to me in my life, and it was, I was in high school, I think the last year of high school, and I was much more interested in basketball and sports, and a friend of mine stole my backpack on a Saturday afternoon and hid it in the theater class, which was happening after school hours in the afternoon. And I had to kind of, knock at the door and sneak in and kind of say, excuse me, this idiot has stolen my backpack and hid it here. And the theater teacher, dear friend Attilio, said, well, now that you've interrupted us, it would be very unpolite for you to leave. You need to stay for the whole class. And I was like, no, I need to get to training. And he said, no, absolutely, you can't leave. And so I was kidnapped for 2 hours.
Kidnapped by the theater.
And then I went back the following Saturday. And yeah, I started, that course. And then with the people there, we then went on to create our theater company. We took over a disused cinema in the local town and started making things, just because we liked hanging around. We all had different interests. There were musicians, people who wanted to do film. We were all kind of learning by making it. And then I started studying at university literature and philosophy, and then kind of took my master's into theater studies. And yeah,
that's it. It's interesting. I feel a connection there, in the sense that I was very into sports at school. And then again, not quite the same way. I wasn't held hostage, but I was kind of my bluff was called when I said to my English teacher, then she said the auditions for the school play were happening. And I said, oh, it's always the same people who do that, get those parts. And she said, well, why don't you come along? So somewhat reluctantly I did, and ended up being in this George Bernard Shaw play and actually really enjoying it. But I remember I felt I had to keep it quite secretive. I didn't tell the friends that I played football or rugby with, because I thought that wasn't cool. So I kept the notion of theatre quite close. Or was it different for you? Was it something you could talk about?
We could. I mean, it was a really interesting class, because we were not doing theater as in, oh, let's do a Shakespeare or a Pirandello, you know, being in Italy. Actually, the teacher was much more interested in using theater as a way of kind of empowering us, you know, which felt quite radical. It is still, even if I think about it, quite radical at the time. So we were making our own shows. We were using that time to discuss our, you know, our politics, our sexuality, our contrast with the institution of school and education and parents. It was a quite liberating moment. Yeah, I think, of course, you know, there was the usual things that maybe 20, 30 years ago were associated with making theaters, that, you know, it was a bit girlish, you know. I remember we were all putting on these kind of very tight black mime suits. And I was like, oh my God. But there was a playfulness to it and a real sense of discovery.
He sounds a very inspiring teacher. Do you still know him?
Yeah. Yes. He's I mean, although we haven't spoken now for a year, and I feel very ashamed not to have seen him, but it was also because of COVID, and he's kind of getting older, and I have kids, so we couldn't really see each other much. But yeah, he's absolutely one of the defining people in my life, not only in regards to theater, really. He's a true teacher, you know, and somebody who was there to really provoke us into not falling into the molds that are created by, you know, school and society and what is expected of you, but
he sounds
really question.
He sounds a wonderful maverick or radical.
Yes,
which
absolutely.
It's great when we encounter them. Do you remember seeing any particular performance that inspired you when you saw something?
Yes, yeah. I mean, many, of course, but if I have to pinpoint one, I remember, I think it was when I had started university, I remember seeing The Far Side of the Moon by Robert Lepage.
Yeah.
Which I completely baffled me. Like, I was like, oh, this is extraordinary. You know, the storytelling, the stagecraft, the story itself. And I basically looked at that. I was like, oh, wow, I want to do that.
Yeah.
I want to do that. And I looked at the people around me. I was like, I want to make people feel like that, you know? I don't know if you've seen it.
I did see it.
Oh my God.
Someone asked me to write for Told by an Idiot, to write my top 10 formative pieces of theatre, and it was in that. I totally agree with you. It was transformative.
Yeah, the way in which I think it was a one-man show, really, you know, but it was so epic, and the inventiveness of it, and the humanity of the story.
And also I remember, my memory of it is also how brilliantly accessible it was. I went with a friend who doesn't go to the theatre, and a group of us went, and we were going in, and she asked the usher at the National Theatre, how long is this show? And the usher said 2 hours and 20 minutes without an interval. And she went to leave, and I put my hand on her arm. I said, honestly, if it's terrible, I'll pay for your ticket, but please stay. And she so loved it. The next night she came back to the theatre with me to watch a Q&A, and she never went to the theatre.
Wow. Yeah.
And I think that's the amazing thing about Lepage, and that show in particular for me was, it was so open to anybody.
Yeah. And I remember also, more or less at the same time, I remember seeing a show by a Russian director, Lev Jordan. Great master. You know, I think he's still working now. He must be like 150 years old. But and it was a 7-hour show in Russian with subtitles, and I thought like, oh, I'm never gonna last that long. And actually, it was absolutely extraordinary. You know, I still have very vivid memories of the show. And yeah, to be sitting in a theater watching something for that long, being immersed in a completely different language, but you know, trying to extract meaning and seeing how as a as a community, you know, 1,000 people, or you know, where we're
Connected.
just kind of connected, was extraordinary.
And you mentioned these two extraordinary pieces of theatre and the very international nature of them. Was that what drew you to Lecoq? How did you hear about Lecoq School?
Okay, yeah, that's the other chance encounter. Because I didn't know much about Lecoq, and a dear friend of mine gave me as a present his book, the Lecoq Poétique is in French. I think it's the poetic body, the translation in English, which is basically his kind of pedagogy, just kind of written down. And at the time, I was working on basically a site-specific performance of King Ubu by Alfred Jarry. And I read this book during the Christmas break, and I was like, oh, wow, this got so many interesting things. And I was particularly interested in the idea of the bouffon, because, of course, with Jarry, there is a lot of that. And it intrigued me. And I thought, like, oh, this man has really kind of created the system. How fascinating, you know, it really... it was really interesting, because I think a lot of Lecoq's work is pushing towards finding this kind of common poetic language, which kind of is beyond language, is beyond the boundaries of, you know, cultural references and nationality. And so I read the book, and then I knew a few people who had studied either with Lecoq or with people who had trained at Lecoq in Milan, who was working with a theater company that was, you know, doing workshops in schools. And I said, like, what do you think? She said, like, well, you should apply. And I wrote them a letter. I didn't speak a word of French at all. And I wrote them a letter and said, I'd love to come to your school. And it was way beyond the deadline. So I thought, like, oh, it's never going to happen. And they actually wrote me back and said, like, oh, somebody's dropped out at the last minute. Do you want to come? And so I hopped on a train, went to Paris. My best friend had just moved there the year before to go to a film school. So I basically said, like, oh, I'll crash on your sofa and let's see how it goes. I might just leave after 3 months. And I stayed 7 years.
Wow. Did you, it's interesting this, because obviously some of my previous guests have studied there, and I was talking to Jos Huben about this. And
who was my teacher.
He's
now a very dear friend, but he was my teacher.
And he was talking about when he went, and of course then meeting Marcello and Simon, and and that sense of finding connections. Are there people that you still collaborate with from those days in shows and things?
Not directly on shows, but as always, you know, you kind of, it's such an intense experience. You go through 2 years in which you're thrown into this blender of you know, art, emotion, humanity, and so there is like quite profound memories that stay with you. And I ended up kind of working a bit with a few people after finishing the school, a lot of them actually being based in the UK, because they went back to Great Britain and kind of set up their own companies. But yeah, I think since I then started working at the Bush Theatre, which is a bit more kind of institutional new writing, I feel, sometimes like those those styles don't really meet, or they feel like
it's
slightly
interesting.
separate.
I want to talk specifically about that point in a second, but just on that moment of leaving Lecoq, at that point, did you see yourself as a performer, or was it the directing thing or writing? What was
I was always more interested in directing, to be honest. Directing, writing, theater making. But then, of course, working at Lecoq, you kind of go through that whole phase of collaboration where you're devising collectively. And I don't know why they wanted me to act. It was never my thing, but you end up on stage. But it was, I guess for some kind of work, mainly the non-verbal work, you kind of feel more at ease. I think then when language started entering the room, I kind of felt, oh, is this really my thing? And to be honest, what I've always enjoyed, the part of acting that I enjoy is the one that happens in the rehearsal room, when you're trying out stuff, when you're discovering things. I really enjoy performing there within that environment. And then there is the moment where you transition to like, oh, we need to have a show and do it every night in front of people, and it needs consistency. I always go like, oh, I'm not sure I can find new things every night to get.
Can I say, as a performer in my mid-50s, it is something that me and my contemporaries often talk about, is our continued passion and fascination with process, and sometimes the dread of having to perform it every evening.
Yeah. But I have always kind of envied and admired the people who had the fire, to go on stage. And I think that's a very peculiar thing. And you see it immediately. And I remember in the school, you could tell the people that really had that kind of fire inside them. Well, for me, I enjoyed a lot more sitting, watching people do things than actually having to stand up. I took it up as a provocation, as like, oh, I can do something, so maybe somebody can see how not to do it.
That's a very useful tool, I think.
Exactly.
You touched on the Bush, and I'd like us to come to the Bush, because it's when we met, when you and Madani were there, and it was exciting times. I felt at that theatre, and we had many conversations, and for various reasons we never quite got over the line with the project, and those things happen. But I always enjoyed those conversations, and then ultimately I did do something there when you invited me to do some crazy thing where I just encountered the play and the audience at the same time live on stage.
Oh, you did. Which one did you do? Did you do Rabbit, or did you do Nassim, or was it Blank?
It might have been Blank.
Blank, the one with the blanks.
Yes.
Yes. And, I remember.
I enjoyed it immensely, and it kind of brings me to my next question. It's something that you just said, Omar, in a way. Is I always felt that some of the stuff, given now you're talking about your background and your interest, in a sense, didn't sit totally comfortably within a more conventional British theatre structure. So I suppose the classic example was my dear friend Caroline Horton's the Buffon show you made there, Islands,
yes,
which I enjoyed enormously, and I was sadly not surprised when some members of the establishment did not feel this was an appropriate way to address that material, whereas I felt it was highly appropriate. But I think you ran up against that thing which we sometimes get with Told by an Idiot, where they don't feel our form is appropriate to address certain things. Whereas I would argue what you did with that show, which I should say was a kind of satirical, for listeners, a kind of satirical attack on tax evasion and all that kind of, I thought your vehicle of the Buffon couldn't have been more appropriate. But I think the establishment don't want that. They want it to be very considered and presented in a particular way. What's your thoughts?
Islands is such an interesting play. It comes back in conversations, years afterwards, and I have very, good memories of it. Although, of course, there was a bit of a backlash from, I think mainly the press, but also from people. And I remember I've been working a bit in Germany lately, but I've always kind of had a few friends coming from Europe and Germany specifically, and I was telling them like, oh, I would say probably a third of the people really, really disliked it, and a third of the people had no idea what was going on and didn't have an opinion, and a third of the people loved it. And they said like, oh yeah, that's the perfect show, isn't it? I said like, well, not by British standards, I can tell you. So for me, that was a kind of revealing moment, because in a way I thought, well, the show is doing what it needs to do. It is provoking people, it is provoking reactions. And I think sometimes with certain subjects, and it was very interesting to me how that subject, specifically being money, was, they just felt it was going a step too far. And it was, I would say, trivializing maybe something that deserved a different kind of lens or a different kind of platform, while actually we never set out to do that. If anything, we were very, very conscious about the fact that we wanted to create an equivalence between money and as it as it were in that specific show, or cherries. But there was a lot of scatological references, the ugliness of it, and Caroline, when she started writing it and she shared the idea with me at the beginning, was really, really adamant to not treat the subject with kind of velvet gloves, but actually wanting to expose the ugliness, and the real damage that these kind of very far removed things, bureaucracy, accountancy, and tax codes, actually how they are reflected in ordinary people's lives through actually harm, real harm, when you take it on a global scale. So I think it was the only show that we could have done about the subject in a way. And I still have people, that stop me and go like, oh, I remember seeing Islands. How amazing was that? And I do feel now, especially having worked a bit more in the UK and trying to do the work that I like and that I want to see on stage, at least, or that I feel I can do on stage, is that you need to find the thing that you can do and that is dear to you, and eventually find your audience for it. And sometimes that audience will be very wide, and other times it might be very small, but that doesn't mean that you need to kind of bend your practice just to kind of have a bigger reach, or to kind of appease what is the expectation of the establishment.
I think that's very perceptive, Omar, and it's certainly something I could, Haley and I and John could hugely relate to. I think there's often been times when, particularly critically, people haven't liked our work, and they have, it's kind of angered them in some way. They've got so it has provoked a reaction quite strongly.
But anger is a good reaction.
I think so. It's a wonderful, it's a very good
better
reaction.
Than indifference.
Absolutely.
Better than indifference.
And I think sometimes they end up writing about what they want the show to be, and they're annoyed that it's not that thing that they wanted it to be. It's anyway. Let's talk about something which reached a very big audience. How did you get involved in Misty, and how did that come about?
Interestingly enough, it involves Caroline Horton, because I worked with Caroline on her first show, You're Not Like the Other Girls, Chrissy, which was her first one-woman show. It was a beautiful, heartwarming story, the story of her grandmother, Christiane, who, and her love story, and how she got engaged to her grandfather during the Second World War, and this amazing character, she was half blind and, living completely in her own world, which was to encapsulate everybody else. And that show was hugely successful. It started off at the Fringe, and when Madden and I started at the Bush, we gave it a 2-week run in a double bill with another play by Sabrina Mahfouz. And Arinze Kene, the writer and performer in Misty, came to see it. And Arinze was a writer that was up and coming, and we knew his work as a performer, but he just had like a couple of really good plays on, and we were interested in him. And he came to see this show, and he says like, "Oh, who did that?" And his agent said like, "Oh, it's Omar." It's like, "Oh, I want to work with him." And we wanted to work with him as well as the Bush. So he was the first writer Maddie and I commissioned when we took over the Bush in 2012. And originally we commissioned him for a play, and he had this kind of big idea about the Harlem Renaissance in New York in the 20s and 30s. And he started writing it, and then he fell out of love with it, and then he went AWOL for a year, and then he said like, "Oh, I'm just going to return the commission. I don't think I can do that." We said like, "No, keep the commission, and when you got something, hit us back." And so a couple of years later, he came in, I remember, in the kitchen of the Bush. We did a reading at 9:30 in the morning with his agent and a producer from the Bush, Madani, and I. And he had like this black notebook, a Moleskine, and he written a few skits of what would then become Misty. And we said like, "Oh, shall we do a couple of weeks R&D and then present maybe a work in progress, 30-40 minutes at what we had at the time was the Radar Festival, where we were presenting kind of smaller shows during the course of 3 weeks." And so him and I went into a room for 3 weeks, and we kind of jammed, a bit, and tested the material and explored it. And we came out with, half an hour. We shared it in front of an audience. They loved it. Arinze, of course, is an extraordinary writer, but extraordinary performer. And so we said like, let's pursue this. Let's see if there is a full show in it. And then, we continued collaborating on it. And it became a process of like 5 years, in which we constantly were building and dismantling and rebuilding this play, which is kind of very meta and kind of self-reflective. And to be honest, we had no idea of what was going to happen with it. If they told me when I started at the Bush, this is the only show that is going to transfer to the West End and, be nominated for massive awards, I would have said like, no chance on it. But it's like, this is too far out.
But it's interesting, isn't it? I 100% connect to that, because we did a show that Catherine Hunter directed called My Perfect Mind, which I
saw and loved. Well, it is one of the best shows I've seen.
Well, thank you. But with similar reasons, if someone had told me one of our most successful recent shows would be a show about an old actor having a stroke and not playing King Lear, I'd have laughed. I'd have laughed at them. Which is why I suppose you can never predict, can you, what people will go for and what people will connect with. It's if we could do that, we'd be rich men, Omar, if we could do that.
Absolutely.
Now I'm aware of the time, so I need to bring you full circle to your recent production of The Chairs, which I saw only last week, and I emailed you and I spoke to my friends in the show, the cast, who are absolutely sublime. My first question is a practical one, because I loved your version of the show, as you know, and what you'd done with the show, but it's quite radical. And I know the play quite well. I've seen it a couple of times. And I'm just curious, did you have any issues with the Unesco estate or not?
I don't know how much I can share.
No, you don't.
No, I will. Let me tell you this story because it's a fun story. Yeah. So I had, of course, cleared the rights in 2019 when I started working on it. I had first approached Catherine and Marcello and Toby about it because I had a very specific idea of how I wanted to do it, and I wanted to do it with them. I said, like, I can only do this thing with you guys. And they kind of loved the idea. I spoke about it with Rupert at the Almeida. He loved the idea, and then we cleared the rights for a new translation in which I outlined already what I wanted to do. I said, like, this is going to be a slightly slapstick take on it, and I want to subvert a bit the ending, and it needs to have a meta frame. And I already had started the translation, so I gave them examples, and I've sent this 2-page letter to the estate, and they came back and said, like, yeah, that's fine, you can have the rights. Yada yada yada, like the show gets programmed, then it gets canceled because of COVID. We then find a date, and so come November of last year, when we are about to literally the morning the show is about to go on sale, I get an email from the literary manager at the Almeida, who's forwarding me an email written in French by the agent of the Unesco estate in France, saying, oh, can you please get in touch with Madame Unesco, who is the daughter of Eugène Unesco and the right holder, because she wants to speak to you about this. And I was like, well, but we are announcing in half an hour whether she wants to know. Frantic set of phone calls. I'm the only one who speaks French. So I kind of called the agents, and she says, like, no, she just wants to make sure that everything is fine. You have to listen to her. I was like, okay. And then I called Madame Unesco, and she was, I think in her mid-80s now, and very, she was a literature lecturer at the university. She was a teacher. And I think also half deaf, because she started shouting in my ear without allowing me to put a word in for the first 10 minutes, and basically saying, so I've read your translation, and I have no idea why we need another translation. There are perfectly viable translation of this play available. But anyway, whatever. One thing that is very important that I want to know from you is, who is the emperor for you? I'm like, well, the emperor is, a figure of authority. No. The emperor is God, sir. The emperor is God, and you must know that. I was like, well, I mean, a figure of authority is God as well. Like, no. And then, she was very adamant that I shouldn't add anything to the play. And I said, like, well, there is, I have the rights for the translation, which I've done, and then the directorial stuff, these are just things I need to try in the rehearsal. And finally, she gave me the authorization, although not very enthusiastically. I did invite her to see the show, knowing that she would never make the trip. And so, but of course, I've cleared it with the Almeida, with the producers, and I think there is the UNESCO estate is nowhere near as protective as, say, the Beckett estate, which doesn't allow you to change anything. And I think also my background was, like, I've seen productions of The Chairs in Europe where anything is done to the play, to the text, to the stage direction, because that's just the way we do it, in directors' theater in Germany or in Italy or even in France. So I wasn't very concerned. No. And at the end of the day, I thought, well, let's try and see what happens. They're not going to shut us down.
Exactly. Because it's so fresh in my mind, I think amongst the many brilliant things it did, for me, it captured the true spirit of the play, which is what I think a really good new version should do. It had something that absolutely tapped into that and made it feel fresh. It was interesting sitting in an audience at the Almeida, and because in some ways, and I don't mean this rudely, it sounds rude, but it's one of the few theatres I go where I still feel quite young when I sit in the theatre. What was glorious was seeing an older audience really laughing, really enjoying.
That was quite surprising. That was quite surprising because, and actually, I mean, there was an interesting mix. I think, yes, of course, maybe the majority of the audience at the Almeida is.
No, I'm being flippant.
But it is true. But they also run these schemes, so they give away quite a lot of free tickets to under 25s, and we had a lot, and I was really intrigued to see how they were all laughing. So there was something quite interesting about that generational gap being bridged by something very simple, but also extremely complex, as you know, as comedy, and almost going back to the origins, or kind of a bit of a sweep of all the history of comedy from commedia dell'arte to slapstick and stand-up. That was quite fascinating to witness how they connected immediately with that. And I don't know if it has to do with also, after 2 years of not really being in a theater and, not sharing that space, like laughter is such a contagious
I couldn't
thing.
agree more. With our current show about Charlie Chaplin and Stan Laurel, which has had various versions over the last, a bit like Misty. When we brought it back last summer, I think the joy of that collective laughter was so much, in some ways, more almost like it was a kind of necessary thing. I felt people needed to be able to share. Are there plans for it to go anywhere else, or you don't know yet?
We're working on it. I think we'd love to take it on an international tour, just because, of course, Catherine and Marcello have that kind of network and audience from working abroad quite a lot. It is quite a demanding show. So,
my word.
When they finished the run, they were exhausted.
Well, when I saw them on the Monday evening, the three of them in the bar, and it was so nice to see them. And in some ways, it was very poignant for me, because the last time I saw the three of them on stage together was in that theatre 30 years ago in a Complicité devised commedia piece, Help I'm Alive. But they did look tired. But I thank you for that, because it was such a joyous show. Omar, we could chat for much longer, but we've kind of reached the end of our time. I'd like to finish with 8 very short questions, and you just have to say your first instinctive response. Is that all right?
Let's do it.
And apologies for any mispronunciations of names. Samuel Eto'o or Zlatan Ibrahimovic?
Eto'o.
Order or chaos?
Ordered chaos.
Fellini or Antonioni?
Oh, interesting. Fellini.
Reggae or soul?
Reggae.
If you we're talking about the 7 deadly sins here, which of these sins are you most prone to? Gluttony or sloth?
Both.
Pinocchio or Peter Pan?
Pinocchio.
And this is where you prefer to drive, in Milan or Paris?
Terrible cities to drive in, both. I'd rather bike.
Okay, you can have your bike. Omar, it's been so lovely talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us. And I hope to see you in London soon, or indeed elsewhere.
Yes, absolutely.
Take care, Omar.
Take care. Thanks a lot.
Dear listeners, if you've enjoyed this idiot podcast, please spread the word